Hello, my name is Ana Gloria Guzman, and I'm the Executive Director of Conservation International in Costa Rica. Today, I also ask my colleague Marco Quesada, who is the Vice President of Oceans for America's Field Division, to join me to talk a little bit of our work in conservation and how we implement science for decision making. Marco, I'll go back to you so you can start us.
Thank you, Anna. And yeah, we'll be both brief and also start from regional and move into the more relevant Costa Rica case. In general, looking at global ocean space, there are major driving forces that affect ocean use. Our growing population, for example, affects how we demand services and goods from the ocean. The invention and improvement of technology allows us today to fish wherever we want in any season at any depth, for example. The fact that we are now more aware than we were 200 years ago of the depletion of marine resources forces us also to make decisions on how to allocate them. This depletion of marine resources also has an incidence and conflict that at times continue to grow amongst users. Fishers and divers want to use the same reef for very different purposes, for example. And finally, knowledge. The speed at which we better understand the oceans actually affect how we use them also, because now we are more aware of how connected the oceans are. If we go to the next slide and look at the region that's the Eastern Tropical Pacific. This goes from the southern part of Mexico and the Gulf of California to the northern part of Peru. This is a very diverse region, huge ocean space, very productive, mostly in tuna fisheries, but also in other resources such as mahi-mahi. The region is also abundant in highly migratory species, many of which are threatened. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that these highly migratory species actually connect very well the existing marine protected areas that the countries have established. This is a representation of science, nothing less than that. It has taken decades to map and track numerous species and their movements across the oceanscape. If we were to look at a global representation of movement across the globe, the global oceans, then we'll see that the oceans are in fact very well connected by some of these highly migratory species. Now, how is this relevant in terms of science? How can science better inform policy? It's a question we have tried to work on and resolve for many, many years. Next slide, please. If we look at for example, at the soundscape, this is if we basically put an electronic ear, a microphone down in the water, we can better understand many things going down there, not only what sort of marine mammals are communicating, but also the sounds that many other animals emit. We now know, and the best science knowledge indicates, that healthy reefs are actually very noisy. Noisy because of fish and crustaceans, shrimp, and also marine mammals bring the reef to life. And actually, many larvae of fish seem to find healthy reefs based on the soundscape. Now, we were making an initial assessment in Costa Rica on the soundscape, mostly looking at the impacts of noise in certain marine mammals, such as the spotted dolphins and the humpback whales. As it turns out, the range at which humpbacks communicate matches the same range at which boats make noise. And it was very interesting to observe certain different things. On the top left, you can see the rate of visitation to a protected area in Costa Rica as it has grown through the years, mostly related to the visit of humpback whales, of these highly migratory sporadic visitors to Costa Rican waters. On the top right, what you see is also how we can use noise and sound as a proxy for biodiversity. And as it turns out, no-take marine protected areas have indicators of healthier ecosystems, healthier marine ecosystems based on the quality of that sound that we hear. Now, on the bottom left, what we see is a match in the seasonality of tourism and the visits of whales to Costa Rica. So this is basically science put at the service of management. We now know for a fact that tourism visitors in these protected areas rise and fall based on the presence and absence of whales. And we can manage to that. Not only we can manage in making the motors and the visitors less noisy, but we can also be better prepared to receive tourists during different seasons. The next one, please. Now, illegal fishing is something we have also studied and taken very seriously, not only in Costa Rica, but also in the Eastern Tropical Pacific region. It is a huge problem. It is estimated to cost up to more than $20 billion per year and represent more than between 11 and 26 million metric tons of fish captured every year and going into the market. Very briefly, if we go to the next slides, illegal fishing crime looks very different in very different places, and depending on the size of the boats also can go from forgery of vessel documents, double registration, fishing without licenses, and illegal modification of vessels. These are problems we are all accustomed to. But if we go to the next two slides, we'll see that the number of examples of fish crime also include foreign captain and crews, unlawful landings, prohibited gears, fishing ground violations, forgery of logbooks. Next, please. Deactivation of vessel transmitters, illegal fuel transactions. There's countries that have cheaper fuel than others, so there's fuel transactions that are illegal. Immigration-related crimes, customs-related crime, and money laundering, just to mention a few. I think that's the last one of that list. Now, that's why we wanted to do some research on what's going on in the Eastern Tropical Pacific and also specifically in Costa Rica. And we saw behavior such as that one boat with a straight line coming from top left to the mid part of the frame. As you can see, this boat comes into the Costa Rican exclusive waters and it starts just like meandering there, just waiting in there. That's a classic behavior that's associated with transshipment from fishing boats to motherships that will then take the hulls. We don't know for sure, because for us to be sure what actually happened that day at that time, we should have sent a boat and we didn't have those resources then. But we know this information and this data that it's now publicly available and easy relatively to access and analyze sheds lights on marine and ocean problems that need to be managed for. Another example is the following one. This is a boat that comes very close to Costa Rican waters. What you see as a shaded gray area is actually outside, 50 miles outside of the Costa Rican exclusive economic zone. And it seems to be fishing just outside of the exclusive economic zone. However, if we zoom in, the next slide, please, you'll see that the boat actually comes into the exclusive economic zone just a little bit. But this technology and this sort of data is also accessible to those who are trying to commit crimes and perform illegal fishing. So not only authorities know what's happening, but those who are actually performing illegal crimes know exactly what's going on. The next one, please. So the last one is just to show you how science and data analysis can be put at the service of authorities. This actually shows fishing vessels concentrations a few years ago in Costa Rica, but later analysis of fish catches in the Costa Rican exclusive economic zone actually matches the presence of fishing boats, and it also matches oceanographic features that indicates that these areas are especially productive because they are very close to ocean fronts, very close to ocean upwelling systems. So these are only some really high optic uses of science and data that can be collected by and used by countries such as Costa Rica, but also will have better sense when we act on this type of data from a regional scale. I'm now going to hand it to Ana Gloria, who is going to dive in deeper with mangroves. Actually, many of these species connect with mangroves, sea turtles, sharks, and even the prey that tuna eat are connected very well with mangroves. So there's a lot to be said about this great ecosystem, Ana.
Thank you, Marco. It was great to have that regional at scale overview of some of the threats and challenges that we have at a national scale. And as you mentioned, mangroves are one of these key ecosystems that we have in our coastlines that are not only important for biodiversity, but also for our coastal communities' livelihoods. So for now, I'm gonna navigate and deep dive into what we are working on: mangrove conservation, restoration, and blue carbon. And as Mark mentioned, Costa Rica is a small country inland, but we are 10 times bigger in the ocean, which means that we really need to take a hand of science and technology to bring information for decision making and conservation for both the people and the nature that we want to ensure are long lasting. In Costa Rica, what we do is also align and support development of opportunities and science and data that can help the country achieve and construct actually their country commitments towards important international conventions, and also to ensure that there is pathways for sustainable use and development of insurances to keep our ecosystems providing the services that we all rely on. I'm going to share a little bit more in deep of the analysis that we've done in time. Since 2014, we started our work to understand what were the threats and where was the loss of mangroves that we have in Costa Rica. This is an analysis, and this slide shows an analysis that was done a few years ago on the most important areas of mangrove ecosystems and the percentage of coverage that they had in that time. But now, in looking into the Gulf of Nicoya, which is the area that we have focused our work on, we have been able to understand some of the elements that were threats and what were the challenges that we faced on these of ensuring that we have this mangrove coverage protected, but also where we needed to work on restoring the mangrove that was lost. These laws happen in time. Since 1995, mangroves are actually protected in Costa Rica as old forests, but that doesn't mean that before then we had threats and we had loss caused by development, caused by increase of agricultural expansion and other activities in the coastline that actually have impacted the quality and the condition of these ecosystems. For the Gulf of Nicoya, as I mentioned, we did an analysis from 1956 to 2014, where we assess where the areas that were lost in that time frame to be sure that we work with the authorities and local communities to prioritize where we needed to recover. These ecosystems are critical for providing services of protection and for fisheries quality, which is one of the most important activities in the Gulf of Nicoya. Here we show the loss that we had and the gain, because since 1995, as I mentioned, these mangroves were protected, the mangroves are protected and forests were protected. And from then to 2014, we did a little bit of gain, although we still have a long way to go to recover some of the losses that we had in time. This is to show you again how we did some of the science that was able to inform us what was the carbon stock within our mangroves. And this is including not only the tree or the parts of the tree that are above ground. We did an in-depth analysis on the soil carbon that was accumulated in the mud. And for these, what we understood was that mangroves, comparatively to the transformation that suffered for developing shrimp ponds and salt ponds, we lost around 92% of the carbon that we had. These not only represents an important element for science, but also for decision making. This was critical to prove that protecting and ensuring that we restore mangrove ecosystems are going to help the country and the world to achieve its climate commitments, and also to restore the services, the other services, not only carbon, but the services that these mangroves provide on local communities, in particular, access to fishing resources and mollusk collection. Now I'm going to present to you briefly a little bit of a project, the most important project on restoration in the country that we were able to support with the authorities and the communities. This is the Punta Arenas wetland, which is a protected area that have lost a significant amount of mangrove in time before it was protected. It currently expands of over 3,000 hectares of mangroves within the protected area, but there is a need to restore around 500 hectares. Our task was actually to restore at least 300 of them through the implementation of a process that includes science, includes work with the stakeholders, and also involvement, of course, of the authorities to ensure that this is integrated into the national efforts for mangrove and wetlands conservation. So the first steps that we took was actually to understand what were the elements on how these mangroves were. So we did an analysis with specialists to understand what is the forest structure in the mangrove that is currently standing, to understand how will the mangrove be once, or should be once it's restored. We also did an analysis on how much carbon was in these sites, in these areas, both in the areas currently with forest and the areas that have to be restored, which in this case were big plantations of sugarcane that had been sugarcane for over 60 years. We also did other analyses on the physical-chemical conditions of the soil and the water in the area to understand how the conditions, or what is the ideal conditions for the mangrove to be restored. This is done through different techniques, understanding, doing plots to have this structure of the forest. We also take samples from the ground to doing in the laboratory to use to understand the carbon stock. And we also use technology that can give us the information on the conditions of the physical-chemical conditions of the soil, for example. The other element that we did was an analysis on how the hydrological flow has changed over time. This means how the rivers and the water from the tides comes and flows from into the site and into the mangroves. These have changed over time. What we found out is that the complexity of the river and the river structure has shifted over time, which has had an impact on how these ecosystems actually behave. And therefore, some of the areas that were mangrove needed to restore that condition of water flow from the tides to ensure that these mangrove areas could be restored. In these second images, you can see the different threats and some of the areas that were lost because of these expansion of the sugarcane plantations, and also the difference on the conditions of the soil that we had to face. The other element that we had, and this is in the third picture below, is an impact on shrimp ponds that were or are currently in the limits of these mangroves, and that also has a need to be work with the authorities to ensure that everything is done by all the regulations, but also to ensure that the areas that are already back into the ownership of the government can be restored. But going back to the Punta Arenas wetland, one of the biggest challenges was how do we recover the conditions of the soil that has been part of these sugarcane plantations that are now back into the protected area, into the conditions to be mangroves again. And the process that we did was actually developing a series of primary and secondary channels that allow for the tides to come into the soil and ensure that in time, because it is an in-time process that is going to take from 10 to 20 years, to become a forest more naturally, allowing for the seedlings to run and come into the channels and ensuring that the soil will get the humidity and the salinity for it to be restored in time. And in the next slide, I'm going to show a short video of how it looks at the scale that we did this in one of the sites in Punta Arenas. So here you can see the sugarcane plantations, and now you can see how these channels were built to ensure that the tide flows back into the ground and allow these conditions to be restored in time. The importance of science, as you can see, was critical to ensure that we were able to draft and build this restoration process. And this is also not only important for the communities and the country itself for restoring these mangrove ecosystems, but also for achieving our commitments. And one of the important elements here is that we have been, as a country, able to incorporate and to be actually very ambitious on how these elements as conservation and science are integrated into international commitments. And we currently have very strong linkages and very strong inclusion of mangroves and blue carbon into our national determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. We also have built a national decarbonization plan. We also are part of Ramsar. Therefore, we have these actions integrated into our strategic action plan, and of course, on how we as a country report our advance towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The other layer of this is how we build an standardization and how we scale these kind of programs at national scale. So we were able to work from the science and the knowledge that we built on a national restoration plan. We also were able to work with the authorities in consolidating carbon accounting protocols that are actually now added into the national ecological monitoring of mangroves, which are essential to ensure that every actions that every stakeholder and authorities are doing can be accounted and are monitored in time. And this also, of course, goes alongside with development of these pilot sites that are not only going to be pilot now, but are going to have a pathway so that we can replicate as a country how to restore effectively these ecosystems along with the authorities and the communities. And that's why we feel that blue carbon is science bringing to policies. We also know that the information that we have built and had been collected in time on how much carbon is stocked in the soil and in the mangroves itself are now integrated, and it's going to be included into the update for the national greenhouse inventory structure to actually separate mangroves and separate soil from the mangroves to be considered into the inventory. So these soil carbon accounting has been not only important for science, but it has been critical for the country to start building up and improving its baselines for climate commitments. We are also working on including these elements into a national blue carbon strategy that is under development with the authorities to be sure that we also have the next steps written and that can guide the country on achieving its commitments as well. There are also other elements that we know are critical and that are based on the science that we were able to develop, that is making the connection of the ecosystem services that these ecosystems provide through a process or adaptation of the Payment for Ecosystem Services program that could be applied for marine ecosystems. And this is critical to ensure that we integrate as a country how these mangroves and these ecosystems are part of the sustainable livelihoods and the well-being of the coastal communities. And just to close, I wanted to share a little bit of that. It's important to always work these elements and work these projects in hand with the local communities, and also to build opportunities for them to be part of the solution. In Costa Rica, we have been working on bringing local communities not only to the conservation and restoration efforts, but also to look into new ideas or new production systems or products that they could build and that they can own, like production of chile or production of turmeric or other agricultural elements that are sustainably developed alongside with their commitment for conservation of mangroves. And this has proven not only a critical element for engagement of the communities, but also as an alternative livelihood and supported income for the communities itself. And the other element, of course, is ensuring that we keep on working and presenting an outreach campaign. So we have delivered several elements of communication pieces and brochures and elements that are shared through the different social media to ensure that we as a country also understand better what is the importance of the science and the mangroves and the services that they provide to all of us. And in terms, just to keep highlighting the importance of science, I think one of the important next steps that we have as a country is to ensure that we keep this restoration and carbon monitoring in time. We can keep accounting for the accumulation of carbon into these restoration sites, that we work together with the National Greenhouse Inventory in their integration of mangroves and mangrove soil, as well as to how we replicate this process, not only for mangroves, but other blue carbon ecosystems that are important for Costa Rica as seagrasses and marshes. And of course, keep working on the restoration projects and ecosystem services and alternative livelihoods with the communities. So that's for us how we wanted to share a little bit of how Conservation International is working, bringing this science both at the regional, national, and inside scale, not only for improving conservation, but improving livelihoods and improving the country's capacity to respond to current needs. So I wanted to thank you all for your time and looking forward to meeting you all soon.